welcome to another edition of The Magical World of G. Michael Vasey. And in this episode, I'll be talking to Dr. Andy Cooper. Andy and I go back a few years, having met at a particular school of magic where we were both involved. And in subsequent years, Andy has formed his own school, Helios. So I spoke to Andy about magic, NLP, schools of magic, and why he started his own. Let's get started by asking him how he got into magic in the first place.
It's an interesting story because it wasn't through a direct interest in magic, let's put it that way. I was a corporate trainer, and my early training career in the late 1980s, I was working for a big international news and media corporation. And I said to a friend of mine, what is it that makes a really good trainer? What's the difference between a great trainer and an average trainer? And he said, you need to go and learn neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. And I'm like, what is that? So bear in mind, this was 1991, when NLP was not well known at all, particularly in the UK. I went and researched it, and I did a practitioner program in NLP over a period of a year at weekends during 1992. And I have to admit, I found it somewhat confusing, somewhat kind of interesting and challenging at the same time. And I wasn't quite sure what to make of it, to be honest. And 6 months after I finished it, this same guy said to me, Andy, he said, I'm going to Hawaii to do my NLP master practitioner. Would you like to come with me? And I thought, that sounds a great idea. And amazingly, I persuaded my boss to pay for me to go as a work kind of development thing. Wow. So I went to Hawaii and spent 3 weeks in Hawaii doing my master practitioner NLP training with Dr. Tad James. It's probably fair to say it totally and completely changed my life. I met people there who I'm still very friendly with to this day. It showed me potential and possibilities about what we could do as human beings and how we could change our life that was just amazing to me. That set me off on a really interesting quest. I was 30 at the time. So I started investigating personal development in a much bigger way. I went
Just a second, Annie. Let's resume this in a minute, because one of the other questions I had, I'm not that familiar with NLP. What is it exactly?
In a nutshell, in the late 1970s, there were two academics at the University of California, a guy called John Grinder, who was an associate professor of linguistics, and a friend of his, Richard Bandler, who was doing his PhD and looking at cybernetics. Bandler and Grinder were exploring all kinds of human potential in the 1970s. Yep. And Bandler had studied Gestalt therapy with Fritz Perls, and he was very interested in Gestalt therapy. And the combination of Bandler's background in cybernetics and systems and his interest in Gestalt therapy and Grinder's interest in linguistics started them on a journey of making connections between what made people really good at what they did and were the differences between people who were really successful and people who weren't, and how did that play into linguistics and personal development and emotional clearing and the kind of whole big picture of all of those things, and how did they come together to create, if you like, people that were really successful versus people that were not so successful. They studied two key characters in that period of time. Virginia Satir, who wrote the book People Making and is really the mother of family therapy, and Milton Erickson, professor of hypnotherapy in Arizona. Erickson and Virginia Satir were remarkably successful at taking people who were very dysfunctional and essentially fixing them. So Grinder and Bandler looked at, well, how do they do that? And they started to model their behavior and looked at, well, what do they do? How do they work with their patients? What do they say to them? How do they enable them to change? And what they discovered was that, to their surprise, the approaches that Virginia Satir took and the approaches that Milton Erickson took were diametrically opposed. They were completely different, yet they both got amazing results. To follow that research through, they worked with a whole group of interesting people in California at that time, including Gregory Bateson, and they looked at work of Noam Chomsky. And what came out of all of that in the sort of mid 1980s was this whole corpus of material that they called neuro-linguistic programming. Neuro because it's to do with the brain, linguistic because it's to do with language, and programming because it's to do with the order and sequence in which we process information inside our head. And they were particularly interested in how we do what we do. So they subtitled neuro-linguistic programming the study of human subjective experience. The study of human subjective experience was looking at the structure of how we create the world inside our head and how that representation of the world inside our head influences our behavior and our success, essentially.
Right.
And
So
what came out...
I can see a link to magic straight away. Go on.
Exactly. Well, it's no surprise that one of the main books that Bandel and Grinder published was called The Structure of Magic, Volume 1 and Volume 2.
Right.
And they absolutely studied various spiritual and shamanic traditions in addition to studying psychology and hypnotherapy and gestalt therapy and all of the other things that they looked at. So that amalgam of all those different disciplines came together in what Bandel and Grinder called neuro-linguistic programming. And the people who then went on to take that further, people like Robert Dilts, Dr. Tad James, even Anthony Robbins with his book Unlimited Power, were looking at how do we take this material and how do we apply it in business, in education, and in healthcare. They were probably the three biggest areas. Right. And so I became interested in it because of the applications in business, primarily for my job as a trainer. How does it make me a better communicator and a better trainer? But of course, once you step on that path, of course, it isn't really about are you a better trainer or a better communicator. It's really about, well, how do I just get better at what I do? How do I become the best I can be? How do I look at what's going on inside of me and what's working and what isn't working, and how do I fix what isn't working? The biggest gift that NLP has given me is that it has put us at cause in our lives. It has allowed us to look at everything that happens and say, how am I creating that? What do I need to do if the outcomes I'm getting are not what I want? And what do I need to change in order to get the outcomes that I want? And not from a place of self-blame, from a place of there's no failure, only feedback. What I'm doing isn't getting the results that I want. So how do I do something different in order to get the results that I want?
Okay, so let's resume the story then. You did the NLP thing in Hawaii, and from there?
And from there, Dr. Tad James, who taught NLP, also taught Huna, the Hawaiian shamanic system of healing and spiritual development. And so I started learning Huna in 1994. The way Tad James taught Huna was very much from a spiritual healing perspective. It is an amazing system of spiritual development. And I spent 2 years studying Huna and was initiated into the Huna shamanic tradition. And during that time, I also did my NLP trainer's training. But I came back to the UK in mid-1990s and thought to myself, well, this is great. And I absolutely love Huna, but it's not the native traditions of my own islands. So if I was to look at what's my own spiritual tradition, what's the Western mystery tradition from which, me as a Westerner living in the British Isles comes from? What's that heritage, if you like? What's our spiritual lineage? And that drew me to look at the so-called Western mystery tradition and to the books of Dion Fortune. So that's kind of what got me into the whole Western magical tradition. And I remember reading a copy of Prediction magazine, which is long out of print now. And there was a quarter-page advert in the Prediction magazine for various different magical schools, including the Society of the Inner Light, the Servants of the Light, the Arcane School. And so I actually wrote off to all of these schools because this was 1994, 95, and we didn't have the internet then in those days the same way. So I wrote off to them and they sent me back their paper brochures of their schools. The school that I was most interested in was the Servants of the Light. It seemed to be a school that was aligned with the kind of things I was interested in. And I always tell this funny story. I wrote to Dolores Ashcroft-Nowicki, the head of the school at that time in 1995, I think it would have been. I wanted to do a workshop that she was advertising, and it was called an advanced workshop in ritual magic, I think it was. And I thought, oh, that sounds good. So I wrote off to see if I could apply and said that I was a trainer of NLP and hypnosis and that I was interested in magic and could I attend the workshop. And I got this extremely terse postcard back, a postcard of Jersey where Dolores lives, St. Helios. And on the back it just said, "Dear Mr. Cooper, hypnosis and NLP is no substitute for magical training. Dolores Ashcroft-Nowicki." That's all it said. I've still got it. And I thought, okay, well, that's told me then. Yeah. So I didn't get onto that workshop. I did, however, start studying with the Sons of the Light and met Dolores Ashcroft-Nowicki later that year in December. We completely hit it off. It was like we'd known each other for years. And that's how I ended up studying with the Servants of the Light.
Yeah.
And how I ended up getting into studying the Western magical tradition or the Western esoteric tradition or whatever we want to call it.
Yes, indeed. So that brings me to another $6 million question for you. What is magic?
That's a really good question. So I would say that magic is a spiritual developmental system that through that process of mental, emotional, and spiritual development, we learn processes, tools, and techniques to allow us to create the kind of life that we want to have. That's the process of magic. We could look at medieval grimoires and casting spells and all kinds of things, but the bottom line is this is a system of spiritual development that enables us to create truly magical lives for ourselves and the people we love. For me, that's what this is about. It isn't about creating or learning a system that enables us to manipulate other people to do what we want or to get more money or get people into bed or whatever it might be. There are people who want to study magic for those kind of self-serving reasons. Yeah. But for me, it's a much bigger picture than that. This is about our own spiritual development, and spiritual I use in the widest possible term. That encompasses emotional development, mental development, spiritual development, even physical development in a kind of coherent model. So if we look back to ancient Egypt, for example, we look at the training of priests and priestesses in the temples in Egypt. And they were taken in when they were 8, 9, 10 or 13 years old and trained throughout the temple system. This was a completely holistic process of teaching emotional, mental, physical, spiritual development. It wasn't just here's a bunch of techniques to get what you want. So for me, magic is about the process, the system by which we develop mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and create truly amazing lives for ourselves. And I would add it's even more than that. There is some very interesting distinctions in the different traditions that teach this huge thing that we call magic. So we could look at the Golden Dawn tradition, for example, within the Western mysteries. We could look at even the Druids, or we could look at the Wiccan kind of tradition, or we could look at the Egyptian mysteries or the Kabbalistic mysteries. I mean, there's a wide range of different paths, if you like, within the Western mystery tradition, which we could, in a very large picture, call magic. Some of those traditions, like the Golden Dawn, for example, focus on how do I utilize magic and learn magic as a series of tools and processes, and through that I become kind of spiritually developed by going through a series of initiations in a very kind of Masonic way, if you like. And that's the focus of what they do. The focus that I'm interested in is different to that. I would add another component on top of learning the magic and learning different tools and techniques and all the meditation, everything goes with it. Ernest Butler, who I wish I'd met, but sadly he died before I had an opportunity to meet him, added another component, in my opinion. And Ernest Butler was he was an esoteric Christian. He was a very spiritual man who managed to combine his esoteric Christianity with his Egyptian occult kind of views and his Kabbalistic views into a coherent whole. And I definitely am not an esoteric Christian. However, what Butler did was he introduced a component into his magical system, if you like. If you read his books and if you see what the SOL became, he introduced a component of devotion into his training and into the mix. Mm-hmm. Now, people mix this up, or they interpret this in a wrong way. So the way I look at it is that in ancient Egypt, which is the model I would always go back to, there was a system of mental, emotional, spiritual, physical development that was the training of priests and priestesses in the temples. But there was also the element of worshipping the gods. Now, that wasn't done in a subservient way. It wasn't done in the way that says, I'm not good enough and I'm waiting for you to save me type of perspective, like modern religions do. It was done in a way of there's a higher power that is represented, symbolized by a god or a number of gods who are essentially aspects of the one god. I mean, someone described the ancient Egyptian religion as polytheistic monotheism, which is an interesting oxymoron, but I think it's a good description. If you look at it that way, then as a practitioner of the magical arts, as someone who is committed to their mental, emotional, spiritual, physical development, as someone who is working within a spiritual tradition and utilizing the power, if you like, of the unseen realms, then equally there's an element of giving back. We're taking, but we also give back. It's a symbiotic process. And that symbiotic process is a process of honoring the powers that we are calling upon to help us get the outcomes we want, if you like. And it isn't as transactional as that, but the kind of description works. And that element, if you like, of that honoring of those powers is, you could use the word devotion, you could use the word worship. I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but there's that element of, when you become a priest of or priestess of the mysteries, you're not just a magician. You're not just calling on powers and using them to create an outcome. You are more than that. You are a priest or a priestess. There's that element of being in communion with and in connection with those higher powers. It's not just calling upon them and using them for a specific end. There's kind of more to it than that. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, absolutely. Just recently, I tend to use Facebook quite a bit, mostly to keep in touch with family and friends, but also to promote books and things. And I set myself up as a member of a number of supposed magical groups, ranging from Golden Dawn to Franz Barden or something like that.
Yeah. And
I've noticed that increasingly you get these people just coming on and saying, I want to learn a spell, how to become a millionaire. How do you do this? And I worry a little bit that this is what people are really interested in terms of magic. So I think that stepping back and looking at what we view it as and talking about what it really is, it's not about just getting stuff. It's about developing yourself, and it's about, I think I absolutely agree with you in terms of element of the powers that be and working with them and giving them back something. It's all part of what I believe in too. And maybe that's because we just share a school background, so to speak. So what was it that determined that you would set up your own school?
You and I both studied with the Servants of the Light, and it's a school that I absolutely admire and honor and learnt an amazing amount from. And particularly from Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki, who was, in my opinion, or is still alive, is or was one of the greatest teachers of the 20th century. For that, I absolutely believe that to be true. And having said those things, clearly, when I came to study the Western mysteries within a magical school, be it Servants of the Light or any other, I brought to that experience my corporate professional training experience, my being certified trainer of neurolinguistic programming and hypnosis, and the ability that NLP gives you to look at everything from a meta level, to look at it not from the experience of what's my experience doing it, but also to rise up above that and look at it from the perspective of how is this experience being created? What's the structure of my experience as opposed to just my experience? Because when you can rise above and look at it from that perspective, you can see how you might tweak and change the structure to enhance the learning experience. When I started looking at traditional magical training from that point of view, I started to see, well, things could be made very different and more efficient. They could be made more effective. And for me, the biggest thing, which is my hobby horse, if you like, is that we have lots and lots of people who want to study magic. And I have no problem with that, by the way. They want to go and learn ancient Egyptian magic or Kabbalistic magic. They do their daily meditations. They love doing ritual. And so do I, by the way. I love doing ritual. But for them, that's the be all and end all of their experience. And it can be a spiritual experience and it can be a very social experience. And that works. But for me, it kind of didn't work, because what you're not doing is you're not dealing with the underlying person, if you like. You're dealing with teaching a system, but the system isn't just how do you learn ritual magic? How do you meditate on the Kabbalist tree of life? How do you invoke an Egyptian god? How do you open the quarters in the temple? There's something much, much, much more fundamental than that, which was missing. And what was missing was, this is about the person. This is about their emotional development, their mental development, their spiritual development. And when you focus on spiritual development alone, when you just focus on the magic, you actually create unbalanced people. You create people who are very spiritual, but in many cases, people whose lives are falling apart. And you see it every day on the streets of Glastonbury, where I live. And I know people will criticize me for saying this, but it's true. There are people who would consider themselves very spiritual, and they are, but they don't have a job, or they don't have a successful relationship, or they can hang around Glastonbury and have a great time. But to me, that's not what this is about. What this is about is not just becoming really spiritual and abstracting yourself from the world. That's only half the story. The real story is that you learn how to develop yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You then take that experience and you bring it back into the physical, so that you create a life in the physical that works, that makes the most of this amazing place that we're here to enjoy and to learn from, for ourselves and for the people we love. It's about developing the whole person. One magical school, which is a very reputable school, doesn't take people under the age of 30, because in this person's words, they need to have got Malkut sorted. Now, what that means for people who don't understand Kabbalistic magic is Malkut represents the physical world of the earth, the physical earth plane. If you haven't got that sorted, if you haven't got your foundation right, how can you build on that to become a much more kind of rounded, whole, enlightened person? So what drove me to create my own school was to look at the different ways of magical training in the Western mystery tradition, and look at how do I build on that with the expertise we have now today in the 21st century of neurolinguistic programming, of psychology, of even Jungian psychology, of hypnosis, and how can we use these tools that we now have to enhance the way we train magicians. And so I founded Helios in 2012, essentially, because I wanted to develop a system of magical spiritual training that totally and completely incorporated emotional development and mental development as well as spiritual development. And they were not separate bolt-ons. It was an integrated approach to developing the whole person, if you like. That's what led me to build Helios the way I did.
I remember talking to people, probably yourself included, at various ritual magic weekends, and sort of discussing topics like, well, when you get to lesson X, everything blows up in your face in terms of your life. There was the recognition, albeit maybe unconscious, that there was a problem, right? At a certain particular point in the course might suddenly find themselves inundated with life issues. And it was almost seen as like it's a distraction. It's the powers that be distracting you away from your true purpose. But in reality, I think that's partly the problem that you're alluding to, is it not?
It's completely the problem I'm alluding to. So, for example, as you well know, there is a tradition, maybe we could use the word, that or a belief or an experience that people go through the first degree initiation quite often. And there's a saying that says you go through your first degree initiation and your life falls apart.
Exactly. That's what
Well,
I'm referring to.
yeah, exactly. The question becomes, well, why? Hang on a minute. We're developing somebody to be more developed. How can that happen, right?
Well, mine did. I mean,
Well, yeah, exactly.
and I know many others that went the same way.
And so my thing was, okay, let's try and understand what's really going on here so that we can address that and see if we can fix it. So here's my take on that for what it's worth. And it goes back to the development of the whole person. So if you develop someone spiritually, but you don't address the mental and emotional development, in other words, you don't clear negative emotions, you don't remove self-limiting beliefs, you don't address all of those unresolved issues from the past. They're sitting there in your unconscious mind, in your psyche. You then develop someone spiritually, and that raises their level of vibration. That's essentially the underlying physical process. People do more meditation, they pay more attention to the inner worlds, they start to raise their level of vibration. As they raise their level of vibration, that energy that becomes increased inside them, the subtle energy that becomes vibrating at higher level, hits in the nervous system these unresolved negative emotions and unresolved limiting beliefs that then present themselves for resolution within the psyche of that person, right? So issues they thought they'd buried long ago suddenly come up for resolution, and people don't deal with it. So they don't know how to deal with it. They don't have the tools to deal with it. So what do? They kind of push it down and bury it and hope that it goes away. Now, what happens when you have a magical initiation experience is that the process of initiation, certainly the first degree initiation, without going into the details of what that actually is, it causes an influx of astral energy, of higher level subtle energies into the subtle bodies of the person. That influx of high level energy massively raises the vibration of that person. And suddenly all their unresolved stuff comes up and says, hey guys, sort this out now. Now, the question becomes, if that didn't happen, if you didn't have that stuff to sort out because you'd already done it, the experience of that initiation will be much more comfortable. I would say, in my personal experience of having run Helios for 8 years now and had a number of students go through the school who have followed our training program, we have minimized that experience. I'm not saying we've eradicated it, we haven't, but we've done two things. We have minimized the shock to the system, if you like, through that initiatory process, because we have people work on their unresolved stuff before they get to that point. And just as importantly, they have the tools afterwards and the self-awareness afterwards to be able to deal with whatever comes up. That was probably the most important motivating factor for me to set up Helios and design it the way we did. And I'm not trying to blow our trumpet here, but to say the wonderful, amazing thing that neurolinguistic programming gives you is an understanding of the structure of experience. Once you understand magical training at a meta level, at the level above the level the student is experiencing at, you can structure that experience because you know how to play with it. When I designed the Helios course, which by the way took me 3 years to write, the first degree program, and I integrated the neurolinguistic programming practitioner certification into the program, I specifically looked at different points along that learning journey and said, where do I want my student to be at that point? What do I have to do to get them to that place? Which bit of emotional and mental development do they need to have got? Which bit of spiritual stuff do they need to have got to get them there? Okay, well, to get them from A to B, what do they need in the next part of that journey? It's that understanding of the process and the structure that makes the magical training more effective and more comfortable. So I'm not saying we've completely eradicated the experience of your life falling apart after you have an initiation. We have actually eradicated that. Your life doesn't fall apart. Is it comfortable? Yes. Does it mean that stuff still comes up for people? Yes, of course it does. And I've got first degree initiates of Helios who will message me on WhatsApp and say, Andy, I've got an issue to deal with. Will you work through it with me? I mean, of course I will. I've got students who they're all NLP practitioners or master practitioners. So they call each other and go, this has just come up for me. Will you help me work with that? Well, that's the kind of community I want to have. I want a community of students and of initiates who are worthy of the name initiate. And that means, as Dolores Ashcroft-Nowicki said in the second degree initiation ritual of the Servants of the Light, when a second degree initiate walks upon the earth is blessed by that person. Now, how does that happen? It happens when that person is worthy of the name of an initiate, because they've got their stuff under control. They're not judging people. They're not carrying around all kinds of unresolved baggage. That they're as clear a channel as they can be at that point, right? No one's perfect at all, but if we can work with people to enable them to be totally and completely committed to their own spiritual personal development, and to know that when they're doing things that don't serve them or don't serve other people, they're willing to look at that and do something about it, then we've got to the point I want to get at with our students in Helios.
You also use a lot of modern technology, so it feels very personal, because I've been watching videos of you, for example, going through various instructions, and it feels very personal because you're watching an image of you talking, whereas in the old traditional once-a-month mailing system with a remote supervisor, I remember feeling quite alone, albeit I looked forward to that package every month arriving, I must admit.
Yeah, me too.
To see what was inside of it, and there was that aspect of it that was always very nice. But I can see how use of modern technology really can differentiate the approach altogether as well. And just poking around, I haven't had a lot of chance, but I see you're also developing quite a comprehensive library of knowledge, and that's also very interesting. And it's because it's video based. It's the sort of thing where in your leisure time you can log on and take an hour and a half of some topic that you've wanted to delve into but never really had the chance to. Is it, if I may ask, is it just you, or are you building an infrastructure, or do you hope to build like an infrastructure of people and content around your core content?
It isn't just me. My co-founder of the Helios School is a lady called Lynn Robinson. She's a third degree initiate like me. She's a master trainer of neurolinguistic programming. She lives in Vancouver in Canada. Lynn and I have been the two driving forces behind Helios. And whilst Lynn is less public than I am, she's no less influential. And in the NLP training material that we are just coming to the end of finishing now within the course, a lot of that videos that aren't up there yet, but you will see shortly, are Lynn presenting the content rather than me. One of the things I really want to do is I want to create a school that isn't about me. And there are many schools that end up being essentially cults around the founder of the school. And I understand how that happens. And I understand that it's a very charismatic personality who founds the school and then becomes the central figure around which everybody coalesces. But it isn't about me. It's about the teaching, and it's about the processes we use to enable people to be the most amazing, magnificent, best they can be. It's not about Andy Cooper. I'm just the catalyst for that to happen. So I'm really keen that we have other people involved, and that those other people share their knowledge and become part of a community that is, as long as those people are all aligned with the way Helios operates, then in many ways, the more the merrier. And what I mean by aligned is there are some core fundamental beliefs that underpin the way we operate. And that is personal responsibility, number one. Taking responsibility for the results you create in your life, and when it isn't working, being prepared to admit that and do something about it. This is not about judgment. This is about no failure, only feedback. If I'm doing what I'm doing in my life and it's all working wonderfully, brilliant, that's fantastic. If I'm creating results in my life that isn't the way I want it to be, then okay, how do I fix that? What do I do in order to get better at that? What do I do in order to make this relationship work better? What do I do in order to give my kids more love? What do I do in order to, whatever it might be, right? Those fundamental beliefs about a commitment to your own development, a commitment to take personal responsibility for the results you create in your life, and honestly, a commitment to the laws of light, which comes over time. That's not instantaneous by any stretch of the imagination. But at some point through their spiritual development, you develop a connection to the inner planes. You develop an affinity, if you like, with one or more inner plane beings, and that grows into a contact, into a connection to the inner planes. And I think those are the ingredients, if you like, that when they're aligned in that way, then that's the kind of community we're trying to build in Helios. But I want to go back, Gary, to just address something else you mentioned.
Sure.
And that is when you were poking around the stuff on the school site, and we were talking about the use of modern technology. And I would expand the concept of the use of technology. The other part of technology is the technology of the mind. So in order for us to help students to develop and grow, one of the greatest gifts I received from Dr. Tad James when he trained us in NLP was his amazing ability at the time in early 1990s to use hypnosis to install powerful beliefs in our unconscious minds that allowed us and enabled us to be brilliant at what we do. It's that understanding of how you use that technology to do that really enables people to grow and evolve. Now, absolutely, someone would level a criticism. Well, you can use that for bad things as well. Of course you can. Of course you can manipulate people if you were so intent to do so. That's another issue in terms of the kind of people we want in Helios. You don't want those kind of people who are going to manipulate people. But you can use this understanding of hypnosis and of NLP and of psychology to install positive beliefs in people that enables them to do what they do more effectively. And the Helios course has got specific sections within it where we have deliberately layered in and installed certain beliefs that support you in doing what you do. And for me, that's crucial, because what we understood when we did that is we understood that we could short circuit some of the training time. So I've had friends of mine, third degree initiates, people who run their own schools, who are horrified when they look at Helios and say, Andy, you can't train a first degree initiate in 2.5 years. It takes 5 years to be an initiate. Well, it might do if you did it the way they used to do it, but it doesn't do if you do it the way we do it, because we're short-circuiting the process. And the reason we're short-circuiting is because we understand how to use emotional clearing, how to use NLP, how to use hypnosis to accelerate the process. Sure, there's technical learning you have to do, whether it's visualizing the spheres on the tree of life and the colors, or whether it's learning the Egyptian gods, or whether it's understanding how to open quarters in the temple, or whatever it might be. You still need to learn that stuff. But the underlying spiritual, mental, emotional development that underpins that, then we have a way of accelerating that process and at the same time making it more effective.
So if I was a potential student, how would I find out more about the school, and how would I apply, and what would I require?
So require is nothing but commitment, and that's one of the big challenges, because many people want everything handed to them on a plate. So if somebody wants to get fit and they turn up at the gym and they start running on the treadmill or lifting weights or whatever, it's really hard work at first, and they ache all over and they don't see much of a result, and they get up in the morning and they go, do I really have to get out of bed and go to the gym again today when it's dark outside, or whatever it might be? But that commitment that gets them through that first part enables them then to see that within a month or 2 months or maybe 3 months, suddenly they're seeing massive transformations in their body and in how they feel and in their energy levels. Well, the same is absolutely true of magical training. So when people start the process, it's not an overnight fix. It takes time and commitment to learn. So what we do within Helios is we invite people to come and try us out. You can sign up with the school, and for 30 days, you don't pay anything, and you can poke around and you can have a go at the first 2 levels of the training. And you can see whether it works for you. You get invited to fortnightly webinars that are live webinars. You have an opportunity to ask questions. There's a forum to engage in questions with other members of the school. So we open it up for people to have a go at, to have a look at, to decide whether it's for them.
So thank you, Andy. If you're interested in Helios, you can find them on the internet at www.helios-school.com. That's HELIOS-school, SCHOOL.com. You can also find details about Andy and the Helios School in the information below the blurb about this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please do like it, share it, tell people about it, and help support the magical world of G. Michael Vasey. Once again, thank you. Goodbye.
I gave you